It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. The 2016 presidential campaign was not really about issues. Instead, it revolved around anxiety. Anxiety about the reliability and trustworthiness of the two major nominees. Anxiety about not just the future of the country, but whether there would be a future, whether the economic turnaround was real, whether our schools are failing, our retirement safe. Is the government getting in the way of good things rather than making more good things possible? Whether our children and their children will be able to find work that is rewarding and stable. Ultimately, it was anxiety about the American dream, about whether it's slipping away and which candidate Americans believed could save it. In this episode, we continue American Forum's special series of programs growing out of our first-year project. It's the culmination of months of effort at the Miller Center to identify the most urgent issues that would face whomever became president in 2017, assemble nonpartisan groups of experts to study them, and to give practical advice for moving the country forward. So the big question in this episode is, can newly inaugurated President Trump restore the American dream? Or does it really even need to be restored? Is it possible, somewhere in all the division and anxiety, to identify places where opposing sides can find common ground? What's going to happen on domestic issues like tax reform, child care, job growth, infrastructure, and education, all essential elements of the American dream? And finally, how much can happen in the critical first year of the Trump administration, when new presidents often have their greatest level of political capital and public popularity? Our guests today are two former White House aides, one a liberal Democrat and the other a conservative Republican, both steeped in policy debates related to the American dream. Melody Barnes was director of the Domestic Policy Council early in the Obama administration and an advisor during his 2008 presidential campaign. She was chief counsel to Senator Ted Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee for 5 years. Today, she's a senior fellow here at the Miller Center. Peter Wehner was in 3 Republican presidential administrations: George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan. He was a speechwriter in the Reagan and George W. administrations and became head of the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives in 2002. Today, he is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Thank you both for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Over the last 50 years, one of the biggest themes in American politics and governance has been this question of whether the government is the enemy. We go back to Ronald Reagan, his first inaugural, and said very clearly that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. But Peter, you're not a Trump guy by any stretch of the imagination, but you've been involved in these administrations, you've been part of this process. In the end, is that still the right way to look at these situations? Is the government the problem, and is now a lack of faith in the government its own extraordinary problem?
Yeah, I don't think it's the right way to look at it in terms of government being the enemy. I've never been particularly fond of that formulation because you can't run a country without a government. The traditional divide here is between big government and small government. Big government from the liberal perspective, small government from the conservative perspective. I'm not even sure that that's the right way to look at it. I think the key here is effective government is essentially what works. Welfare reform, which I think the 1996 welfare reform legislation was one of the most effective social policy legislations in the last 50 years, but we actually spent more on welfare after that was done. What was important was to get the incentives right, and we did. So you had a huge drop not only in the welfare rolls, 60% drop within half a decade, but the condition of the poor actually got better. Then you take crime. You had a huge drop in crime from 1993. Violent crime has been cut in half. That's not because government got smaller. It's because government got smarter in all sorts of ways, policing techniques, incarceration, private security, and that kind of thing. And the Earned Income Tax Credit which came into being during the Ford administration, is one of the great anti-poverty, pro-work programs. So I think what we need to do is to get into a mindset of really what works.
And so what would you say to the proposition that that this is one of the that this perhaps is a major problem, that the active deterioration and the encouragement of this deteriorating view of whether government is important, whether it's good for the country or not, to what degree is that a liability to governance now, regardless, and would have been for any president, but particularly for President Trump?
I think it's a significant problem, and it's interesting. I agree with a lot of what Pete just said. I actually could hear the lyrics to Hamilton, the musical, going through my head as he was talking a little bit. I would use different examples, and I think probably that shows some of our ideological differences. But I agree with a lot of what he's saying, and I think to your question that this is a significant problem. And the idea that we cannot trust or believe in government as an institution starts to fracture some of what allows us to come together as a country. Also, it affects the way that people see policy making, and believing that there is no art or science to any of it, and trust in those that they have elected to lead. Maybe not their elected representative, but elected representatives in general. And I think that is a significant problem. I think that it's critical that we start to address this problem with a lack of trust in the institution of government, institutional distrust in general, the media, and find ways that we can work together. But one of my deep concerns is that we have a president who made a lot of promises during the campaign that I think many, and not just Democrats, but Republicans, don't believe can be met. And that, I believe, will continue a process of ultimately, whether it's 2 years or 4 years from now, or 6, a number of members of American society thinking government actually really just doesn't work.
Well, we seem to also have one newish dimension that I think is a bit different even from the Tea Party phenomenon of 2010 to we've now moved to another phase of this process, is this even more fundamental inability to agree on very basic pieces of information. How does it come to pass that there can be so fundamental a disagreement about the most elementary facts, and then how is it that wise advisors like the two of you can advocate somehow for a return to fact?
What you're getting is a kind of tribalism in politics, right? Our side and their side, and these sort of silos that people live in. So you live in these hermetically sealed off worlds in which all you do is listen to people who have the same opinion of you. And you've got people who now have the capacity to interject all sorts of conspiracy theories and lies and misinformation out there. People latch onto it. Daniel Patrick Moynihan years ago was a great Democratic senator and scholar, said that people are entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own set of facts.
What is also happening, though, which I think is reassuring, and the question is whether or not this is going to take hold, is that there is a movement afoot coming out of Washington to focus on evidence-based policymaking. And in fact, in a bipartisan fashion, in the course of the past 18 months or so, Speaker Ryan and Senator Patty Murray of Washington came together to pass legislation to create a commission to focus on data and evidence and policymaking. And it's a bipartisan commission. I know some of the people on there who are terrific, Republicans and Democrats, and the first thing they're trying to do is say, how do we make data that comes out of the federal government more accessible to researchers and to analysts and others? Once we make that data more accessible to them, how do we find ways to look across government and to better aggregate that data so that we can we can do slices across programs to better understand what's happening in the American populace? How do we do all of that in a way that protects people's privacy? And then how do we find ways that we can build a more evidence-based culture inside of policymaking that also isn't, off the charts expensive? I mean, we know randomized controlled trials and all the things that policy wonks love are extremely expensive, but how do we work from there down so that people in their communities who are trying to do good work can also better evaluate what they're doing, and that we all have access to that, and from there we can make some decisions about how we should govern. I think that is a good place to start because, as John Bridgeland and I have written about, right now, sitting inside the federal government, we don't have the necessary architecture so that we can make better policy decisions based on data and evidence, which in theory at least should help us to navigate some of the in your corners partisan divide.
One of the solutions, and I think Melanie was getting to this with bipartisanship, but I'll speak sort of directly to what I think it requires. It requires people of standing, including presidents, to tell people in their own movement and their own party certain facts they have to accept that are uncomfortable. It doesn't work if Barack Obama is telling conservative Republicans what they have to believe, or George W. Bush is telling liberal Democrats what they have to believe. That it doesn't work that way. People aren't attuned to it. They're going to say that person is an opponent, that person is an enemy, and I reject it. But what you have to do, and there's no, I don't have an easy solution for it, but you have to get people who have respect within that party or within that intellectual movement to be able to begin to challenge more people that are part of that movement or part of that party. And if that doesn't happen, given the environment that we live in, this is going to just continue to accelerate.
Most of what we've been talking about here is kind of trying to work through the frustration of the inability to arrive at agreement on facts. Let's see if we can shift somehow into more of a discussion of what we think might happen in the current environment that we're in. Where might things go in this first year of the Trump presidency as it relates to some of these domestic policy issues? I mean, in the range of things that have been talked about, I mean, President Trump, while a lot of his policies, it's not entirely clear what they're going to be, but on infrastructure, there's been some specificity about that. The idea of an infrastructure bank that would then be used to leverage up to $1 trillion of total funding for infrastructure projects, and that would also have job growth and broader economic impact. That's one that's actually very similar to things that the Obama administration pushed for a long time and that conventional Republicans were very opposed to. Nonetheless, that sounds like a point of agreement, that there's some agreement between at least two factions in this picture over the value of a plan like that. Is there a meeting point in there somewhere?
Maybe. You're exactly right in your characterization of something that the president pushed for, President Clinton pushed for in terms of infrastructure bank, and in fact, linking that to repatriation that would happen during a tax reform process. So those things are true. I think in part there will need to be a decision made by Democrats, the degree to which after recognizing that there is now President Trump, that they want to work with this administration. I mean, I think certainly coming right after the election, there are a number of people who were so intensely frustrated with that outcome that the idea of putting wins on the table with this White House was something that they couldn't imagine. I think recognizing that the nation moves forward, that there are problems that need to be solved, and infrastructure can help solve a jobs-related problem. It can help address some of the concerns in the private sector in terms of the infrastructure that's needed with our ports, with our bridges, with highways, et cetera, to make that work more effectively. And it is stimulative, or could be stimulative, even given where we are in our economy right now in nature, that there could be a movement to work with this White House on that.
What would you say to the Democratic congressman or the Democratic leadership that said there's an overture from the Trump White House to say, look, some of these Republicans are resisting my desire to do this thing that looks a lot like what you wanted to do. Why don't you work with us on this for the good of the people? What would you say to the Democratic leader who said, I'm not working with you. You know, your people, those guys over there who are in league with you, resisted everything we tried to do. So we're not gonna help you on anything. And meanwhile, you're trying to dismantle our most important signature objectives. I mean, is there a way beyond that impasse?
Sure. I mean, theoretically there is, and even practically there is. You know, one of the first calls, maybe the first call that George W. Bush did after a very divisive 2000 election was to George Miller and Ted Kennedy to talk about No Child Left Behind. An interesting thing about President Trump is he's actually ideologically probably more flexible than most of the people he would have run against. He was a liberal Democrat for many years. He was a Democrat for most of the 2000s. And he has talked about policies more that liberals have embraced than conservatives over the years. So there's a kind of ideological flexibility. The complicating factor here is his temperamental instability.
But doesn't all of that suggest that what highly responsible, empirically grounded policy theorists and activists should be doing would be encouraging some sort of alliance within the Congress, that the idea that some group of Democrats and some group of Republicans should be working to come together on some agenda that actually involves the kind of give and take compromise that hasn't been there for a long time, and then be presenting that as a, if you want immigration or major border control changes, then that can only occur, Mr. President, if you go along with a broad package of other things that have been agreed to by Democrats and Republicans in the Congress. I mean, is that the kind of approach?
That certainly could happen. I mean, if you imagine a certain set of actors, you know, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, they've known each other for a long time. You know, they both know how to cut deals. You know, Speaker Reince Priebus. I mean, you've got people, including the new head of legislative affairs in the White House. You've got people who understand how that process works.
But Peter, is something like that something that, whatever it means when one says conventional Republicans, whatever that means, but is something like the scenario that I just mapped out, which is essentially congressional Republicans, more traditional congressional Republicans, trying to effectively take control of the Republican legislative agenda and make the president the weaker party, the weaker player in that sequence. Is that something that Republicans would seriously think about, like you?
Well, certainly it's something I would think about, yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that, frankly, that the Republicans on the Hill are thinking about. If you talk to them privately, I think that their hope very much is that Donald Trump's is contained on Twitter, as problematic as that can be, but he leaves the governing to the adults.
But what I'm trying to figure out is there some path that the American people, that responsible citizens, that engaged Americans can be looking for some signs of, okay, here's a way that even somebody who was energetically anti-Trump on the Republican side could see as a possible path forward. And is that a path that somebody like Melody could also see some virtue in? I mean, we talked about infrastructure. Are there other domestic policy issues that offer some kind of, is education one?
Well, I was actually going to mention tax reform, because there has been, one, because it's been on the top of the list and something that has been talked about since the election as a top priority for President Trump. Secondly, because particularly with corporate tax reform, there's been some circling around that for quite some time. And what the details look like will matter. But I think that's a place where we could see some movement. And there are certainly things that sit inside tax reform, and even when they get to beyond corporate, and there's some sense that they may go to personal reform later down the road, and things that I think that we agree with. And in fact, you see other Republicans and a history of bipartisan support around the earned income tax credit, for example, and the child tax credit and expansions there, which also address issues for the working poor and for others. So that might be an area where we could see some potential movement.
So the challenge here isn't the same as it would be if, say, Ted Cruz had been elected president, right? If Ted Cruz had been elected president, that was a person who's much more ideological. Donald Trump is a deal maker. That is a characteristic that he's had. He's not an ideologue by any means. He's ideologically and philosophically rootless. Now that gives the capacity to make a kind of agreement. His whole life has really, I think, been characterized by making deals. And so he may well want to do an agreement with Chuck Schumer. He may well like Chuck Schumer more than he likes Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan. I don't think that there's going to be a kind of ideological loggerhead that you might have gotten with other Republicans or with Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton.
So, Peter, if there were one thing that you were going to ask President Trump to do specifically to create some sort of bridge between himself and you and Republicans, the kinds of Republicans you represent, I mean, he clearly needs that kind of repair. From a conservative agenda perspective, he needs to bridge the polarization just between himself and his supporters and people like you. What's the one thing he could do in the next year to stabilize, to reassure you and stabilize that alliance?
In terms of legislation and where to go, I mean, I would say kind of pick them. There are a whole series of issues that he could do. Tax reform would be one thing. A responsible immigration reform would be another. And education would be a third. I don't think he has to pass fantastically ambitious legislation. I'm not even sure that's what's necessary now. It may be that we're at a state in our politics where a kind of incremental reforms are necessary. I will say that it would be, from my perspective, helpful if he were to back away from his protectionism, which I think can lead to a global recession if he really pushes this thing beyond the rhetoric.
Throughout the campaign, there were comments about being a law and order president, which stem back to and hearken back to other dog whistles from the past that have unleashed really dangerous and undermining policies on low-income communities, particularly communities of color. And I think he can do things that reflect a new way of looking at addressing crime and crime policy that are in fact related to data and evidence, that begin to roll back or continue to roll back the mass incarceration of now millions and millions of individuals, more than most in the developed world, many who are people of color, many for minor crimes that are fracturing families. And that would be an important step forward, along with issues that pertain to workforce training and education. What he could also do, which I don't see him doing, but appropriate ways of addressing issues with the Affordable Care Act that don't prevent millions of people from losing their health care. Those are the kinds of things that he could do that would start to let people believe that in fact he would be the president for all Americans.
These are long days ahead. Pete Wehner, Melody Barnes, thank you both for being here. A reminder before we go that American Forum is about the presidency, about how great leaders make decisions, how average leaders make good decisions, and how all of us can advocate for what we believe and resist what we oppose, but to do it in a way that still respects just how effectively our political system has ultimately worked for 200 years. We all have a patriotic duty to share our views, but to never give up on our fellow citizens, no matter how mad they make us. If you'd like to join our conversation about these or any of the issues facing our new president, go to the Miller Center Facebook page, visit millercenter.org, or follow us on Twitter. My handle is @DouglasBlackman, Melody Barnes is @MelodyCBarnes, and Peter Wehner is @Peter_Wehner. In the coming weeks, American Forum will continue its focus on the first year of the Trump presidency, with episodes looking at immigration, broken government, as well as a look back at the first years of key presidencies in our history. Guests will include Washington Post columnist E.J. Dionne, famed American historian Gary Gallagher, and Brian Ballo, host of NPR's Backstory. For more about our First Year project, go to the website, firstyear2017.org. I'm Doug Blackman. Thanks again to our guests. See you next week.